Hey Bree,
Hi, Jane.
welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Let's have a conversation today about shame.
Okay, this is going to be well attended.
Yeah. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction about you first, and then I'll give you an opportunity if there's anything that you want to add or modify. So this is my friend Bree Greenberg. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist who's been in practice for 23 years. She's an expert in eating disorders, addiction, and abusive constellations. She's the founder of VTCIT, the Vermont Center for Integrative Therapy, which was an outpatient center for the treatment of eating disorders, trauma, and mood disorders with an integrative approach, with doctors, nutritionists, psychiatrists, yoga instructors, and trauma-informed body workers on staff. Her work with debilitating eating disorders is highlighted in the documentary film All of Me. Her work spans the worlds of mental health and psychotherapy, energy, structural and organizational change, and art. Her work is also informed by a long history of contemplative practice in Theravada Buddhism. She now lives in Florida. She's a mom, and she's a lover of fashion and art. Anything that you want to add to that?
Ooh, that sounds great.
Nice. So yeah, I have known you for about a year in kind of a variety of settings, like as friends, as a client here and there, and as a teacher. I've been in some group containers that you've led where you've taught this model, among other things, this clinical model that you've developed in your 23 years of practice and sort of been continuously refining in that time. And I've been really blown away by your model in a personal way, like for myself and how it applies to me and my path. And then also as a practitioner, as somebody who does energy work and body work for people. I find that this is one of sort of the foundations of the work that I transmit to my clients. So yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about that and why we're having this conversation today on shame. I think that this model that you teach, it's like, so it's a clinical model. Again, I want to kind of highlight what I find to be the intersectionality of it. I touched on it a little bit in that bio. But when I think about your model, I think about how it really lives at the intersection of a lot of different fields. Like there's the eating disorder and addiction treatment part, there's the trauma healing part, and then there's this aspect of like awakening and liberating the erotic and also breaking out of double binds, abusive, extractive, oppressive systems. And I think the power of it, from my perspective, really lives at that intersectionality because a lot of other worlds that I step into, um, even if they have a really robust treatment model or approach, it doesn't have sort of like a wide enough frame. Um, yeah, I think another thing about your model that's been really impactful for me is how it has this focus on the energetic architecture of all of these things. So to me, I feel like it really gets into the depths. Like for me, I'm a really energetic person. I do energy work. Like anything that doesn't get down into the energetic layer doesn't feel like it's going far enough to me. Um, yeah, so with all of that being said, I'll go into now why I want to talk to you specifically about shame today. Um, I think shame has been one of the most interesting energies for me to work with in my own path and with clients. For one thing, it's just incredibly pervasive. It's incredibly debilitating. And there's something in its nature I find that's it's almost a little trickstery in how hard it is to find, how hard it is to observe, name, identify, disidentify from, get spaciousness from, sort of like find oneself apart from it and then work with it effectively. And I don't find that many people saying really interesting things about it from my perspective, or like saying anything beyond a sort of elementary approach to working with it. Um, and I have found your model and your teaching to be an exception to that. There have been a number of times where you've said something very specific, like there's a way that you very specifically mapped um, where shame will come up in the path and how to navigate it in a way that has really landed for me. And then I'll stay with it and kind of, hold it in the background and use that in the coming weeks. And then I'll kind of come back to your model, a couple of months later and again find a little tidbit about shame that's like really helpful for right where I am with working with it. Um yeah, anything that comes up for you as I say all that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the two things that come up for me just as you're speaking are that shame winds up being really hard to work with, I think, because it's part of a primary consciousness. And so usually we're working with the components of that consciousness rather than the entirety of the consciousness itself, with shame as a primary player. So I think that's one of the reasons. And the other reason is that shame is a primary oppressor. And so when we think of oppressive systems, we often think about the externally oppressive systems. And sometimes we think about like perfectionism or like self hatred or self criticism or self judgment as being internal oppressors. But the reality is, shame is driving all of those things. And it's often driving it from an invisible place. It's when people talk about shame as a feeling, that just doesn't even come close to capturing it, because it's more like a consciousness or an experience of yourself. And identity gets very linked with that experience. And so, what we know is that any place where identity is linked is a place you're likely to not see and to unconsciously defend.
Mm. Yeah, can you say a little more what you mean about it being a primary consciousness?
Well, so shame is really linked and often appears in places where we have had the primary experience or the most fundamental experience of lacking in love, attunement, resource, um, abundance, safety, all the things that we usually think about as having attachment based ruptures. I don't use that kind of language in general because to me, attachment work suggests that this is familial only and that it can be healed in one lifetime looking at one particular familial pattern. But the reality is, in our culture, we all carry different kinds of volleys or challenges with attachment because our attachment has gotten narrowed so much. Ideally, attachment is provided by like a community, a large group of like extended family members, something that you're part of in multiple places, including the land, including past history of ritual. We've sanitized out or eliminated so many of these things that what has happened now is we find that our sense of belonging now comes from what we can purchase or what our identity becomes within a colonized society that identifies certain identity qualifiers as having value: a skinny body, a facelift, a young girlfriend, a nice car, money to buy good food. I mean, whatever the things are, we have these sections that we say that give us power or agency within our society. And so, because we are devoid of these larger structures that inform existence, visibility, being seen, being witnessed, which should never boil down to one father and one mother. We are already making things too narrow and scarce by default.
So would you say, in a sense, that some of the shame that we're working with is sort of an inherent or natural response to that like wider disconnection?
Yes, and I would say that there's a fundamental place where when we are disconnected from that, we know that there's not enough. And it's like at a biological or foundational level, we feel that absence. And absence often translates to a sense of shame, which is
Mm,
really this sense of like, I'm not enough, or there's not enough for me, so it means something about me. You know, when a child is young, all of their reflection and referencing is external, right? They don't have an intrinsic, internal, developed sense of efficacy and selfhood yet. And so, what we see in our culture is that people don't develop past that well enough anymore. And some of that is societally, we're missing these components that would allow that maturity to stretch and develop. And so it's like hampered in all of these places. And I have this ongoing argument with the psychological community that we're narrowing it too much to being about like my parents and your parents and our family, right? This thing is huge.
yeah.
This
Yeah, I
thing
get
is huge.
that sense more and more. Like the further I go in my path, the more that the childhood aspect feels just like one piece of a fractal.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And one that we spend an enormous amount of energy, both time and money, trying to find a solution for. And I always say that the solutions are only there at the very early stage when like you need more self-development, but you should be moving past that stage. And as a culture and as a culture in psychology, we have not moved very far past that stage.
Yeah. Yeah, it's another thing I love about your model is I often hear you refer to it as a maturational model. And so a lot of issues that we see that are pervasive in our culture are actually like they are necessary, important stages, but we should be moving through them.
Yes, 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 exactly. It's not that they shouldn't be here, it's that we're not supposed to be stuck there.
Yeah,
Yeah. And shame, as you know, really keeps one stuck. It's
right.
paralyzing, right? Because
Totally.
shame is about invisibility. Shame is about hiding. Shame is
Yeah.
about undeserving. These are the stories that come with shame, the base stories. And they're also about shame is also about the thing that creates massive, ever growing senses of self doubt.
Yeah.
And all of that becomes completely paralyzing in life. And then the shame just becomes recursive. Now you know you're not moving forward, and you know there's a movement that wants to take place. And so then you self blame. And then all of these cycles are kind of happening within that. You stand in that place for long enough, and you become buried by that. And then we call it a diagnosis.
Mm. Yeah. Oh, wow. That's so powerful. The shame that comes, shame and self-blaming that comes from the initial lack of movement that's caused by shame. Yeah.
Yes, 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 it's crazy. It's
Mm.
crazy because in us, we always know what our belonging is asking for, right? Even if it's hard to hear, we almost always know when it's time to leave, when it's time to make a different choice, when it's time to speak, when it's time to be quiet. But shame is one of the primary modifiers of those actions and movements. And so we will often favor shame's demand over our movement,
Mm.
which just keeps belonging at bay.
Yeah. There's something about it that I find almost a little trickstery in the sense that like something I've been developing for years is a real orientation towards being as honest with myself and my internal experience as possible, right? And like shame I find is one of the hardest one. Like here and there, I'll just uncover these ways of like, oh my God, my shame had me so far away from the thing I actually wanted to do. And it was so hard to not realize that I was rationalizing it with like, no, this is actually a very sensible thing to not do. You
Yeah,
know?
yeah, yeah. Totally, totally,
Like you can
totally.
do that, you can do that with any experience that you're disconnected from, right? But like there's feels like there's something special to me about shame where it's uniquely good at orienting me away from something while hiding the fact that it's doing so.
Totally, 100%. I mean, that's why I talk about like, the desire to be honest with yourself is really the desire to be naked in my model. So it's less about like, this sense of developed honesty that is so popular right now in psychological and new age circles. You and I have talked about this before because I hate that. And so like there's this sense of developed honesty that has been oversold to me around transparency and like all your feelings and all of these things. And it's like, okay, there's a piece of that yes, we need to relearn how to find expression. We need to relearn how to articulate in a way that allows us to not just cover everything. But at some point, there's a pointedness that develops that is less about like thinking about divulging, being something, or anything. It's just a moment to moment honesty that is arising as it comes. And that is really it is really the thing that does not allow shame to be a driver.
Mm.
Shame is still a driver in developed honesty.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting. There's also something you talk about in your model that's like this way that we hide so much, but then our desire to be seen and to be naked is so strong that it will find ways, and it'll often come out in these like inappropriate overshares or something, or just being naked for no reason, or like being really indulgent about it or something. You know what I
Yes.
mean?
Yes.
It's
Yes.
like
Yes.
it's like I see it as sort of this like skillfulness or maturity that needs to develop of like, okay, it's actually good to also have privacy, like know
Yes.
how and where you like being naked with life, but being intentional about where you're being transparent and why and where you're like being private.
Yes. And the thing is, we have so many techniques out there to like develop those things. But the truth is, those things begin to naturally arise when there's a source of rootedness that's happening in your own being. And that source of rootedness in your own being becomes fairly unapologetic. And so that really takes the place of then having to develop from all of these tools or workshops. And it just becomes this guidance that you're following.
Yeah, I love that. I also feel like the strength of that is that we're all so different. And so our expression is going to look so different, and no tool is going to be like anytime I try to do somebody's practice as my daily practice, it immediately fails because I know internally what I need my practice to be, and it's not anybody else's exact. And
That's right.
like
That's right. That's
it
right.
just
That's right.
gets more and more true because like more and more of myself gets excavated.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. 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 And that's why when we had the center, I often used to say that like we were probably the only people I had ever heard of that had all of these interdisciplinary, techniques or like interventions, but we were using them to constantly adapt and curate care to where the individual was at, understanding that an individual is, overlapping bodies that are fractal constellations that are constantly kind of moving and being shaped. And that there's no formula for that except responsiveness. And
Mm.
it's the responsiveness that shame really mitigates. It dictates and says you must follow somebody else's way in order to belong, right? Because it follows from this sense of force or demand that is so deep that says you will not have a place if you don't comply, if you don't give up your identity for this or whatever.
Yeah, I love that about shame mitigating responsiveness. Um, yeah, it reminds me of I had written down a couple of the things that you've said in the time that I've known you that have really struck me about shame. One is about shame being ameliorated by growing into your expression, not by something like love practices. Um, and that we pass through those gates many times over as our systems evolve. Also, yeah, there's also something in that same that wherever that was a teaching of yours or something, if it's not recognized by you and those around you, it stays invisible and intact and then holds you back through the channels of helplessness, victimization, doubt, and self-questioning. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about like what are ways that people listening to this, like if they hear this and it lands as true for them, we're saying there isn't one specific way because everybody's so different, but like, is there any general advice that you would have for people for when they're finding themselves in those channels of shame, helplessness, victimization, doubt, self-questioning? Like, what are some of the moves to um not push that down, but like separate it out a little bit from being the primary driver?
Yeah, I mean, the good thing to do with that is to ask the roots of the shame, like what stories or what ideas are attached to this and what identities are holding this in place. One of the things that really goes with shame is helplessness. So, shame, impotence, and helplessness kind of live very close to each other. And so when we see or experience shame, we often feel like we can't do anything about it. And it almost always is hiding some part of our expression or holding back some part of our expression. So the quickest antidote is actually to know what the expression is and then just do it.
Mm-hmm.
Like actually reveal the thing, say the thing, make the move, just not allow shame to act as the oppressor.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes, as you said, shame is more of a pollinator underneath. And so we may not notice it necessarily discreetly, but we notice the way our posture is, or the way our breath is, or what happens when we walk into a room. And so those are always the places where you can observe shame's presence and then begin to like turn your awareness towards it and be curious about what stories can be holding it in place in that moment.
Yeah, nice. I love that. I have this memory of being in person with you one time and asking you if you could do a little bit of like energetic work for me. And so you sort of tuned in to my energy and you were like, "What is all this shame?" And you just started waving your hand like this. And it was like I was living in this house with really thick walls. And the walls just started like thinning out and the air quality started to improve a little bit because more air could come in. It was like this part of my experience just started dropping out that I didn't know was there, because it was so default. So I think sometimes it's just this is one of the reasons why I really care about getting to know that signature, that energy of shame, is because like when somebody can do that with your experience, they can take your default experience and be like, check out this part. See how that's not actually you? There's something about having that experience that can be intensely powerful.
Yeah. And I usually categorize shame right alongside with grief as those things that if they are built up and unmetabolized, they will really hold you back. Grief is the same way. If we like bury grief and it just collects energetically and it has not been run through enough, you have this thick film that's
Mhm.
between you and your life and the world basically. And shame is it looks the same way to me and often is with grief.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. Yeah, we had a conversation about that one time. I remember I was working with some pretty deep in my body freezes, and I think we uncovered together that it was frozen grief, actually, which I hadn't heard anybody else talk about that before. Like when I think of freezes, whether they're long term or more situational, I had thought of them as a fear thing until then. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, those are just ways that our primal bodies hold the contents of this very like intimate information. Shame is very intimate information. Grief is very intimate information. This is very close to like our closest experience of beinghood.
Hmm.
And so it's always going to be at those base layers that we're really experiencing, and it might not be so visible.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that point too about how it's going to keep happening in our process. Sort of like, um, yeah, it's like every time we like go to expand or step into something new, it's like it'll come back up. And I love that you mentioned doubt with it too. Like doubt, I kind of feel as its own energy, and it's very interesting to me how it can be something that I'm just holding with me and I can project it onto all of the stuff around me, and I can really project it onto myself where it's kind of just this um distinct energy. But yeah, I have these times, sometimes it'll be like a full day or something where I can just feel a very thick doubt energy moving through, and it's kind of like I can't do anything about it except focus on not getting lost in it and just let it move. But it might be a day where it's like not great for me to be working with clients, not great for me to be trying to be really creative or something. It's kind of like if I can just kind of like go off on my own and like rest, and like it can be really brutal to like feel some of the depths of that stuff, because it does inevitably, I'm going to feel it about myself and everything that I believe, as it's moving through.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And as you keep knocking out some of those core stories that go with the shame and the doubt, even if it arises again, it won't be as debilitating because your attachment to it has shifted. And so our attachment to these primary intimacies is so strong because they're built of the formation of our identity. And so those are very hard places to get at and like dissipate or take apart because they're, like we said, they're largely invisible. You often need somebody else to be a mirror so that you can help to even see where the thing is. And then in addition to that, because that intimacy makes them so close to the way we hold them in our bodies.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is a really important skill for practitioners, is to know how to find these and like work those edges without completely like destroying somebody.
Yes, 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 yes. Oh my gosh, yes. We have so little ability to do that. And I would say, as a practitioner, you're going to have a really hard time working these things if you have not worked them in yourself.
Oh, I
Because
think it's impossible.
it is, but practitioners are doing it left and right,
Yeah.
even if they don't know it. Like, you're going to
Yeah.
be working with this whether you know it or not.
Right, right, right. I think my experience of it is that like these energies don't even arise in the container when that experience and capacity isn't present. And I'm not saying you can't do things that'll like,
Oh, you're right.
you can still fuck people up and like trigger those things very bad. But yeah, there's something about like when I'll go to see a certain practitioner who really has been through it, it just comes up like from
Totally.
me.
Yeah, totally, totally. Because our energy fields really can suss out immediately the scope that is
Right.
available, and we will only fill that scope.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it into words. Yeah.
Yeah, and the same goes true with our lives, Jane. So, like, if our lives are too small for us, we will only fill the scope of them often, and then we will feel shame about that.
Mm.
Like, and that is just part of where the shame will intrinsically arise in response to this knowing, this fundamental knowing that we are making ourselves too small in comparison to like who we are, who we have the capacity to represent.
Yeah, that's so cool. I've never thought of it that way. It makes me think like the way that a lot of people talk about shame is like, at least in a healthy system, when you experience shame, it's telling you that your behavior, like that you're currently engaged in, or maybe just did or something, is outside of your values or your moral code or whatever. But this is like a much
The
more
least of it.
expansive view of that. It's like, you're not, come on, you're not like living the life that you're born to be living?
Yes. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, this is over the last couple of years specifically, as I have kept like observing the way energy moves and then the expression of the energy that arises from looking at the structure. what I have seen is that much of what we qualifying as being so psychological is actually just structural. Like
Mm.
it's we are in certain structures and there are certain responses that are going to come up within those structures. And there are pieces you can absolutely do and should do as a part of the process of pulling out of those structures. But the reality is it's largely invisible how those structures are holding us in some of those places.
I'm not sure that I followed the distinction with the psychological and the structural.
So I would say that like the structural is okay, I'll just give you like a weird example. So like a couple weeks ago I walked out of a yoga class here and Sydney was like away or something at that time. And so I was
Your
here
kid.
alone.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I was here alone and I walked out of the yoga class. I think it was like 7 o'clock or something. And I was coming home to like make dinner by myself, have dinner, do a little bit of work. And as you know, like I've only been here for 2 years. I don't have much of a community here. I haven't built much of a life because it was kind of a middle ground move for me. But as I walked out, I was like, oh my God, everybody in here has something to go to, and I have nothing. And I felt this immediate experience of invisibility. And I feel it all the time because I don't see very many people where I live, even though I'm visible to friends in other places. But I noticed in that moment, there wasn't a lot of shame, but there was a lot of grief. And I noticed in that moment, I was like, oh my God, this is totally just coming up because of the circumstance. Like, if I was not in this particular circumstance, this particular arising in this particular way would not be showing up for me. And so it's just the fact that we're ecosystemic creatures. We are connected to one another. And when those connections are not adequately there, it doesn't matter how much healing we've done, we don't have enough nourishment that way. And if we don't, our default is almost always shame.
Mm.
And that can't be fixed by healing.
Right.
This is my point about it's not just psychological, it's structural. We have
Right.
this idea that healing is going to make all of these things magically go away, or that we're going to metabolize that emotion for the 900th time and then we're going to be free. No, it's not that simple.
Yeah, it's this like obsession with inner work also over like
Yes.
actually needing material change and having
Yes.
really deep human needs around love and support and care and understanding and visibility.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I was
And
thinking earlier when you were talking about the stuff of like the shame will get easier to work with because of the way that you're relating to it changing. There's a feeling of how much my body has felt colonized and how that's changing. It's like there's a percentage of my body that feels like mine, and that number felt low before, and more and more the number is going up, and I feel all of these like thresholds crossing as enough of my body becomes really feels like my own. You know what I mean?
yes.
And but there's also this element, like you're talking about how ecosystemic we are, like in a very real way, my body is an organ in the body of my family. And that is true. That is just true. Even if we don't live in the same country.
Yes, and you
And like,
can't take that away with healing. You're
right,
not meant to take it away. We're
right.
not meant to be artificially doing this. And so if you don't recognize that piece, the embeddedness of all of us within each other, and the impact of the way societally things are set up, you'll just never escape from doing the work. And then you'll be waiting your whole life to be free when freedom is actually always right here.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes me want to ask you, so you're a family therapist, you've worked with this is another thing that I love about your model. It feels incredibly robust to me and it has a capacity to like not just that it touches into all of these different worlds like awakening and mental health and trauma healing and expression. and erotic life force, but like it just has a capacity to hold a lot of different realities. I've really noticed the feeling of how much you've iterated and refined the model over the years with just working with so many people. But so when you've worked with families, you get more of the constellation to work with, which isn't to say that everyone there is like, I imagine, really showing up to do it. Like,
Not all participating.
right. But still, you might have a big portion of this specific constellation in the room. I wonder what you would say to somebody who is on a path like this, who yeah, can't work with some of those constellations. You know what I mean? It really does have to be a solo thing, like it is for a lot of people, and it's really not, my sense is it's really not supposed to be like that, but it's just where we are.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, it's always lovely to be able to work with a whole family if it's possible, because in general, the symptom or expression that one person is showing is something that the entirety of the organism is holding and actually attempting to contend with. And so there's so much benefit to having everybody come together and see the vastness of that and the capacity for it. Um, but if it's not possible, it's also possible to do really good constellation work in the absence of participating family members. And it's possible to just hold that frame in ritual work,
Mhm.
and in work with like honoring the ancestors that go all the way back and the land. So there's many ways to also include this, and I always encourage people to like include their families in their healing work. And it could be with just a photo. Do you know what I mean? Like that photo of their grandmother or great grandmother. Like I have my grandmothers on my altar. They're both holding me when I was like a 5 month old baby. And they're right on the center of my altar because, they're my most immediate maternal lineage on both sides. Um,
Yeah,
so
I love
there's
that.
different ways to do it.
There's a grief facilitator who I found through you. I don't know how to say her last name, Dr. Mia Hetenyi, something like that.
Yes.
Yeah, she talks about this all the time, how like we are not meant to process grief alone, and we are not meant to try to do it all through our bodies either. Like she always has us bringing in symbolic stuff into like using salt, using rocks, having rocks on your altar that you are always asking to like hold the grief, hold the grief, hold the grief, and then I go bury it and make space for new stuff, and bringing ancestors, bringing spirits into ritual to help us. Like it's like this big collective endeavor.
Yes, because the nature of us is that we're connected to those things no matter what. We're just pretending like we're not, which is so dumb. And so here we are. It's like all the rocks are outside, all the feathers keep falling from the birds. And so they're all like free and at our disposal. And yet we're like blinders. Do you know what I mean?
I know, and then I feel like a weirdo in certain groups for bringing that in, and it's like
I know. I
it's the
know.
most natural thing ever. What like
I
this? Oh,
know.
this is woo. Okay.
I know, I know. I remember saying to a friend like 5 years ago at like the beginning of COVID or something, 4 years ago, I said to him, I was like, it is so ironic to me that, like, as the Western world is like completely falling apart and disintegrating, it is the indigenous people and practices that are going to actually save us. The exact thing that we shunned into exile. And it is exactly the same with shame. The things that we have shunned into exile, into forbidden, into not allowed, which includes so many expressions of the erotic, including dancing by a fire, putting energy in rocks, creating things that have not been seen before, having sex with the ocean. Like that, these are the things that actually we desperately need. And we don't need to cultivate new expensive practices for them. We don't need to go take a $10,000 weekend shaman workshop because they're always there.
Yeah. Yeah, I was talking to somebody about this yesterday, and I know that we have talked about this before too. That's like part of what is scary about that for people is how messy it is. Like it is so awkward and inconvenient and sometimes socially inappropriate. Like the fact that we are animals and we just have this like erotic life force that moves through us in these ways that doesn't really care about our conventions. You know what I mean? And
It's
there's
not
like,
very socially acceptable.
yeah, totally. Like, yeah. Um, there's something Yeah, there's another expression of yours that caught my attention at one point that I want to bring up, and it was indulgent shame. You wrote this paper called Hunger, and it's just 2 pages, and it is like one of my favorite resources. It feels like you wrote a really short synopsis of the last 3 years of my life. Like, this is one of the reasons I was most drawn to you, is because I have a long history with disordered eating, etc., that like I had sort of just compartmentalized it into like, okay, here's this like weird, really frustrating, really painful section of my life that I'll never understand, and I can still have a good life and just like leave that over there. And yeah, when I met you and started engaging with your model and how energetically deep it was like, oh, somebody gets it and somebody gets it way deeper than I do. And like, I can see how that was never actually the separate part of me. It was like you're talking about with the shame, it's like the way through. It's the way of understanding myself and my expression. But so you have this amazing paper about hunger as a guide and an ally and how that applies to hunger with food, but really for anything, any kind of hunger that we have. And we have so many genres of like hunger, desire, yearning as people. And you mentioned indulgent shame in the paper. I think Okay, so yeah, you're talking about in eating disorders, and I think this just applies much more widely than eating disorders. So there's like, um, it says in an eating disorder, one common distortion is deprivation through isolation and restriction, polarized with indulgent shame or frantic binging. So when I read that, I had never heard somebody refer to shaming as or shame as indulgent before, but that really resonated for me, especially when I thought about periods of like binge eating and overeating for me. There was this very like satisfying, fun, rebellious, really indulgent kind of quality to it for me that I had never named or quite really understood until I read this paper. So I'm curious what you would say about indulgent shame.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a way that like we can binge on punishment.
Yeah.
So there's a way that like because shame is dictating our sense of self and identity as being metered out or mitigated by certain bad qualities or things that we think have to stay hidden or at bay, many of which are our more primal desires, then often, wait, I'm getting information. um, I'm going to say what I'm going to say and let's see if it still wants me to do that. Often what will happen is that we'll try to consume the shame as a way to try and like tamp down the eroticism that starts to come in. And so, eating disorders, whether it's restriction, overeating, purging, laxative use, it doesn't matter, or the oscillation or the dance between those things. It's an attempt always to keep at bay and to indulge the erotic itself. And we don't talk about eating disorders this way. But the reality is we're trying to fucking lasso her basically there. And then we feel this sense of heightened state from that lassoing. Like we did it. We got the thing that's uncontrollable in control. And so there's this euphoria that comes with that. But then the problem is that euphoria doesn't last because it's not really based on actual natural order or movement. It's based on falsely lassoing or harnessing something that is wild by nature. And so it's the conquering of that wildness that we become so deeply addicted to. And we often do that because we are responding to the way that our original nature got hampered and lassoed at a very young or even pre birth stage by our lineage. So we're pissed about that. So now, because we feel impotent about having been able to have agency within that, we're going to go do it to ourselves. And indulgent shame is one of those ways that we love to do it to ourselves.
Yeah, I find in myself there's this really interesting relationship with power in there where it's like
Yes.
you're just so used to that abusive mentality and like especially for somebody who absorbs a lot of that and doesn't want to perpetuate it against other beings, there's this feeling of like someone's got to get fucking abused here and it's I'm not gonna so it's gonna be me. And
That's
there's this
right.
feeling of like almost like getting separation from the part of yourself that you're abusing, that you're getting away with it or like getting it
Yes.
for free or something. You know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. I know exactly what you mean. And it's that sense of like agency, like you said, power, that like we have felt powerless at our base. And so this is what that is reacting to. And getting power back online is actually the whole dance of spirituality. It's the whole dance of emergence or awakening, which is that when you have an awakening or an emergent experience or experiences, you are now dancing with larger powers than the personal self. And when that happens, every fucked up pattern that you have around power is about to get like lamplit by the sun. And this is why people go into those experiences innocently, thinking that they're trying to heal and finding that they are super messed up afterwards because their whole wiring and architecture around power is through a lens of systemic oppression. It's ordered in that way. It's not just that it's interpreted that way, the actual order energetically has conformed. That is hugely important.
I really know what you mean, and it's really hard to describe as like a lot of energetic phenomena are. I mean, I think you're doing an amazing job, but I'm just thinking about like the more sensitive I become, and especially because I do energy work now and I'm just very attuned to that layer of things, like there are people whose energy is inherently extremely hard for me to connect with because
Yes.
it is so ordered in that way. And
Yes.
unless we are in a situation where I'm able to be extremely direct about what I'm sensing and like it's like I need to have some power in that situation because otherwise that thing is just trying to colonize me.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that's what it does. It's not even personal to that person. It's just what the organism is doing in that order. It can't help itself.
Right.
And so that is it's set on destruction basically and colonization. And
And
yes,
protecting itself in the face of somebody that it recognizes can see what it's doing.
that's right. Oh, yes. Well, that's a whole other layer, which is that exposure is like, it's going to absolutely defend against exposure. And exposure is exactly what it's also hoping for. I
Yeah.
mean, we just discussed anorexia. What we just said is exactly what happens in advanced anorexia. It is running that same system. And if it gets advanced enough, it is also devoid of the Shen because the Shen has left the spirit, or one of the spirits has left the body. And so you see a kind of vacancy there in that colonization, and that is not easy to get back.
Yeah. Yeah, is there anything that you said? I know this is a huge question, but for working some of those energetic edges where you are sort of simultaneously really witnessing what's happening there without being so threatening to that ordering of the energy and the sort of like oppressive foundation of it, that it's just like the person completely stops believing you, loses faith in you, or their system just gets too turned upside down.
I mean, I think the biggest thing for that, not as on a friendship level, because that's its own other transaction, but on a practitioner level, there's a place as a practitioner that you really have metabolized enough of this where, regardless of where somebody is at, your sense of non judgment is just intrinsic. And so when that happens, even if you're going for it, they don't take it the same way because yourself as a practitioner is not doing it. Like when I work with somebody, I don't care. Do you know what I mean? Like Bree. I mean, of course I care, but like I'm not driving the thing.
Yeah.
I'm I'm watching.
Yeah.
I'm watching the thing and I'm watching what my system is looking for as far as openings that feel like they are not pushing past a threshold that is being heavily defended. There will always be a moment when that threshold will actually open. And as soon as that aperture begins to open, then I'm walking through that door with that person. But I'm not artificially trying to open it ever. It's not my job.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I'm really feeling it as you're speaking. There's something about, and I sense this all the time with practitioners that I go, like, I try a lot of people, I try a lot of body workers in particular, and it's almost everyone's a no because I can feel at some level of them that they're pushing me and they're trying to get me to go in a direction and they're not even sensitive to see that that's not the direction my body's trying to go. And
Yes.
it's like you can't clear out oppression with more oppression.
No,
And
no, and you'll be extra sensitive to it, Jane, just as I am and most of us, because the invisibility piece that lives at our base wants so desperately to pay somebody to actually show up with a degree of attunement. And we're not wrong in wanting that at all. And often when we don't get it, especially from a practitioner, we walk out and we think it's our fault.
yeah, it's a very lonely feeling. It's
It
like
is.
even the professionals can't do it. Like
No,
who am I gonna find? Yeah, I feel
I
seen by
know.
that. Yeah. Let's see. Oh, yeah, there's another one that I want to ask you about that has come up. So I did a course with you, an online course with you last year. It was a 5-week course that you called an advanced practice group. And if I remember correctly, you have a kind of training that is for clients and then one that is more for practitioners. And this one was kind of a mix of both. And so we were learning your model as a way of moving along it ourselves and then also developing skills as a practitioner to like um yeah, to have this model. And I think it was kind of a variety of practices that the people in that group are doing for others. um and there is something in that model. There is a way that you map thresholds and energetic depths that I find really insightful and helpful. Like you talk a lot about these depths that we have to go through and um how much of this model is based on relationship with loss and death. And then also these specific thresholds, whether they're like deaths, energetic deaths, or kind of other sorts of thresholds that you have mapped in some detail. And one of them in particular, you had kind of mentioned finding a lot of things like fear, death, and annihilation at that threshold, and then it being sort of wrapped or protected by a layer of shame. Anything that you would add to? I found that extremely helpful in my own practice, like that shame, fear, death combination I have found a number of times in myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you try to penetrate that layer and often get kind of magnetically repelled out from it. And I would say that within that layer is a kind of intimacy that really solves, in its own kind of way, the abandonment or absence wounding that most of us carry. And so that layer often protects the innocence or intimacy that is within there because it's very afraid that if that gets out, that we will be unsafe or that people won't accept us or whatever the thing is that it has carried as a story. Um, it's kind of the same as like we walk around with our hearts mostly not that open. And you're
Mhm.
not supposed to walk around with like a heart that's bleeding all the time either. But you know, we kind of walk around in a defended posture all the time. And when you notice the difference of being less defended, there's like better breathing, there's more easeful decision making, right? Like there's all of these things that can come up with that. I was telling a chiropractor yesterday, he was talking about how like most people are walking around in this Mike Tyson stance, which he was saying is like this movement towards something. And I was saying that when I've sat long meditation retreats, after like day 4 of sitting in silence, I notice that my whole posture starts changing. And that when I walk, I'm not walking like this and leaning forward or hunched, but like everything becomes more upright and I start leading with my hips, and it happens every time. And it's like just decreasing the stimulation and threat level is going to change the whole way that the body begins to exist. I mean, we don't even realize that we're constantly in a threat level in most places that we live.
Yeah. Yeah. So when people continue to go through these thresholds and stuff, do you see them as sort of living in a more continuously open state, or is it still always fluctuating?
I think it's still always fluctuating, of course, but I think then people often make different decisions about their living place and like their living situation. You know, I think it becomes harder and harder in that space to like live in conventional society and play the same game in it because the game just asks so much of you and you don't want to be asked that much of anymore. You want to exist without so many demands that theoretically are granting you a freedom that actually isn't really true.
Mhm.
Um, so I think that's how things begin to shift for people.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense. Let me see if there are any other ones. Oh, yeah, there was something that you've mentioned about sort of getting something that we as humans do where we get shamed or we shame others at developmental milestones in particular. There's like something when we're young and just throughout our lives where like at that expansion period, expansion and like exploration,
Yes.
trying things out, playing, yeah,
Yes.
yeah, kind of experimenting where there's like a shame door that closes there. What is that about?
Yeah, I mean, this is has to do with the fact, goes back to what we talked about with like the absence of like ecosystemic belonging. So one of the things that has happened is that we're a deeply codependent society. We don't really have a big support for individuation. Instead, what we've emphasized is individuality, which is the idea that like you become an adult and then you go conquer the world on your own. Like you don't live close to family, you go do the thing on your own, and that's making it. And so it's this hyper individuality. But really, individuation has very little to do with whether you leave home and go live far away and how much money you make. It really has to do with how much you can begin to like find and explore and express your own innate qualities that are deeply yours to express. How well you can make art even in the face of a society that is repressing art making itself. And so the more of that that becomes embodied for you, the more individuated you are. And the more individuated you are, the less you need to leave the people who seem to be so fucking oppressive. Now, it doesn't mean that you still wouldn't choose necessarily to not participate in certain things in society. Like, I like my life to be way simpler. I don't want to be demanded upon by like the bank and lots of other places that are going to make me sit on hold for 50 hours so that I feel like I'm participating. So there might be things that I totally make choices around that make my life more easeful and more simple. But in general, even with oppressive people, I may not want to be with them for a long time, but I can still really enjoy them
Hmm. Yeah, that's
because
super interesting.
they're not impinging upon my freedom.
I think that's a really I don't feel like I'm there. I mean, I don't know, it's getting better. It's like the thing of talking about my body feeling less colonized, but it's still hard for me to be in energetic connection with people like that. I think it's really hard to find a way that my natural receptivity doesn't just let that in. And yeah,
Yeah, totally, 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 totally. And I think it's the hardest with people who you're close to. So, people who you're less close to, it's usually easier to not have that because the intimacy isn't as great. But with people that we're close to, where we want intact intimacy, we want transparency, it is often where we feel the most challenged to be with a system that is still running a lot of oppression. The thing is, you have to be able to be separated enough from it to be able to see that it's that person's system that is functioning that way, and whatever impact is a default impact on you, it's not purposeful.
yeah,
And we still may choose to not be with that person in that way. But there's a kind of blanket level acceptance, I think, that comes in. And it doesn't necessarily, like I say, guide a yes to everybody. It can still guide choice to be a no, but it's not a reactivity in the same kind of way. There's a deep understanding.
yeah. Yeah, it feels like a deep understanding paired with some kind of it's like robustness of one's own energetic field or something.
Yeah.
I think that's something that I'm always working towards is having this like expressive, not like a protected bubble, but it's like there's enough of me emanating out and not just receiving that
Yes.
it sort of counteracts that stuff that really wants to push in.
Yes. And that can't happen if you're underfed. So
Yeah.
if people, yeah, I just want to say that because whoever is listening, like there's no, you don't develop that in the absence of food. Do you know what I mean? Like you can, and I have at times, but you still need something. We all need things that feed us. We none of us are getting enough, but
Yeah.
we all need pieces of that. We can't do it while completely starving.
Yeah, it's so interesting. This hunger theme again, something I noticed very clearly in myself is this pattern where, like, when I have not, I don't, like you, I don't really have a community here that's really close. And so I travel to see friends or have friends travel here. And if it has been long enough where I haven't had that in-person connection, and it does have to be in person, my I lose interest in food and I don't have any cravings and I
That's right.
don't nothing hits the spot because the
Right.
hunger in my body is not about food, it's about
Yeah.
connection. And it's
Yeah,
like,
because the hunger
stop
is
feeding me
systemic
food. That's
enough.
not what I need.
Yeah, exactly. The hunger is systemic enough where it turns down the need to actually physically eat.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm convinced that the way we're treating eating disorders and how we currently frame it is so missing the boat of like systemically, biologically, developmentally, what is really happening in here around hunger. And that if we tell this kind of story about eating disorders, there's a whole field of opportunity for resolution that exists that has not existed.
Yeah, I think so too. And it's a reason I feel really strongly about supporting your work and trying to get the word out there, like in service of myself and my clients, but just more widely, like people need it so badly. I mean, it's incredibly widespread, you know? Like why do you think it hasn't caught on more?
So it's interesting. I'm running this 3-part eating disorder training, and it starts on Thursday. And I put out the ad for it, and within like a day, I had 8 people, and now there's 12 in it. There is literally out of that 12, one person who is a practitioner.
Mm,
No, and I advertised in lots of places where practitioners are. I think if I don't know. I could give some guesses, but I think we get very used to the way things are and we don't like things to change.
yeah,
Even if they're not working that well. We just we like things to be stable.
yeah.
We like things to be the way we have done them for a long time.
I actually forgot to include this when I did your bio, but you are what is it, a consulting professor or a
An adjunct professor,
adjunct professor at what school is it? I'm blanking.
Dartmouth Medical.
Yeah, so that's so interesting that like it's really exciting to me that a medical school, a really prestigious medical school sees the value in it and has you come in and teach every year. I feel like yeah, there I would just wonder if there's something it's so big, like your approach, it's so expansive and multifaceted, and I wonder if that's like terrifying to a lot of practitioners.
It is. I mean, when I teach at Dartmouth, I always have a great group there. And there's inevitably a couple of people every year in the group who are like, this is amazing, and we get it, and we want to know more, and this is not practical within our current system. Which is why I always say that, like, training practitioners is really still too downstream for me for where this model needs to actually aim. It needs to be in actually creating systems that then practitioners work at, that then are like in reciprocity with payer systems. Like, this model doesn't work downstream. It has to actually go to the root or the top in order to trickle down and really get to the people where it can make enough of an impact of change. Any other aim is really just, it's insufficient and it will all be chasing our tails.
Yeah, and practitioners won't actually be able to implement it in a meaningful way in their work
Exactly.
environments. Yeah,
Exactly. They still can, but it just won't be as robust.
right.
Yeah, it won't do the full expression of what it can.
Yeah. I think that's most of the like bullet points I had pulled out. Yeah, we've talked a lot about hunger. Is there anything, I'm just kind of throwing out a curveball. I've been thinking about disgust a lot lately. Is there anything that you would say about the connection between shame and disgust?
Yeah, disgust is such an interesting thing. It's definitely not one of the mind states that I have like gone down the rabbit hole with as much, but I would say obviously it is inherently linked so deeply to shame, but it is also deeply connected to the erotic and to desire. So desire and disgust seem to live on a kind of continuum, um, kind of polarizing seemingly from each other, but they actually are part of the same root. Um, and I think that disgust is part of our way societally of trying to shame desire into submission.
Mm, So it's there, Yeah, like in the face of the erotic, like reacting to it or something.
Yes. Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it has this disgust also sometimes can have this forbidden quality to it, just like we were talking about with the self punishment, where it's like the getting away with something, but the disgust is like, oh, you're disgusting. And there at the same time, there's this magnetism towards it. This is what the erotic does. It likes to go towards the dirty things. You know what I mean? Like it likes to get in the dirt. It likes to like unveil and like take the thing off and put your hands in and like make a mess. It doesn't want to stay clean and sanitary. And so,
Totally.
because we've eliminated so much of the movement of the erotic, we have these things now as like aberrant mind states, but they're not at all.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Um, yeah, again, it's like that really animal quality to us that I think people are like ashamed of and scared of, and it's so messy.
Yes. It's so messy and it's so deeply fundamental. And you
Yeah.
can't work around it. Every
Yeah.
attempt to work around it that we have is the entirety of addiction in this society.
Mm.
Yeah, we're just not meant to not be that also.
Yeah. This has been a really fun conversation. I really appreciate all of these perspectives. It felt like we kind of started with shame as a anchoring point or jumping off point, and then like got to touch into all of these other aspects of your work, and yeah, just a lot of your general insight. Is there anything that is coming up for you that feels like we've touched on it and you'd like to say a little bit more, or anything that would round out the conversation from your point of view?
I guess the only thing I would love to add is just that it's good to discard all of your entrained ideas about what's possible and what's impossible, and also to discard all the ideas about the path to get there.
Mm,
That's like the best I could say, is that like most of the ways that we've been habituated to think about this process, this unbecoming as well as becoming, this shedding, this liberation, whatever the words are for it, this being or this existing space, that most of the ways that we have been handed down and taught and conditioned to think that we're going to get there are actually just meant to get us the very beginning of the way there. And that like listening more to your organic natural movement and nature is something that again is always there and might be hard to hear, but is less costly than 10,000 workshops and 5 ayahuasca retreats. And not to like put those things down, but I think people often think I don't have the resources to do those things. And so one of the things that I often like to say is like, you're here and you can get honest with yourself over and over again from here. And if you don't know how to be honest, then you write down what you're experiencing and you look for the places where your body tells you it feels off. And then you write it again in another way. And you just keep stripping the thing until you find something that feels true to you. And it's like the most simple practice that like so few people do. Um, but it's the way that I practice most of the time in my life, which is just to look at things where they're coming from, how they're being expressed. Am I working around something? Is there something that I'm afraid of? Is there something that I don't want people to see? Like, just those simple things can go a really long way.
yeah, I love that. And I feel like there's this kind of momentum that really builds the more that one does that. And like from a body perspective, it's like the more you get to know your body, it just has an endless wealth of information for you about yourself. like what you should be eating, how much sleep you actually want. Like, I
Yes.
love that your model has this primal body layer. And I feel like so much of what I'm trying to do when I work with clients is help them drop underneath this like really habit-worn energies of addiction and avoidance and like touch into these deeper primal energies here. And it's like, you will know what to do. I mean, not always. Obviously, like we need support and stuff. Like, but I think like there's something in your primal body model specifically about freezes there. And I have independently discovered that in my own path. And it was so validating to find that in your model as well. I had never heard anybody talking about that. These like long-term freezes, very deep in our energy bodies. And like the more of those that I work through, and my body develops this momentum with it where it does it faster and faster. It's just like onboarded that skill. And so it can like identify them now and just like unfreeze, unfreeze, unfreeze. And it's like, yeah,
Yes.
all of these parts of like this very deep aspect of me just like it's a big part of that percentage shift of how much of my body feels like mine,
Yes.
because I can like move from those places more.
Yes, yes, yes. And if that part is closed off to us, if it's in freeze, we are automatically at the layers above it that are always in compensation for the absence of the sourcing of that. The fullness can't be there. And it's the fullness we really are longing to experience. Most people think they want, you ask them, "Oh, I want freedom, I want liberation." But what they really want is a fullness. They want the robustness and the fullness of voice, of expression, of possibility, of choice. This is what really gets restricted in systemic oppression.
Yeah, the choice, I really relate to that.
Yes.
It's like having more spaciousness and like it's like the temporality changes around the choice.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
There's something else
Yes.
that you were saying about like, so letting go, what was it? Letting go of ideas of tools and letting go of like, yeah, what was it, like the where you think you're going or how you think you're getting there. I feel like
Yes.
there's a whole personal creative game in that too. You know what I mean? There's like, because it's like, okay, am I like letting go and life's gonna show me, or am I like taking control and I'm gonna show life what I want? And how much
Yes.
of that, there's so much subtle, creative, like
Yes.
play in that space. And I don't mean play like it's gonna be fun necessarily. Like sometimes maybe, sometimes really no. But yeah, there's so much of this that like I think I instinctively and people maybe generally instinctively like, but give me an answer about how I am going to get from A to B. And it's like I literally can't.
Right, and you wouldn't want to because the truth of the matter is their finding out is the thing that shapes their maturity. That's the thing that shapes their becoming into whatever it is developmentally that is trying to become. There is no external answer ever.
Yeah, there's like a supporting of the process. It's not
Yes,
a
exactly.
dictation of it. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And a knowledge of how the process often unfolds, which has orienting scaffolding with it, right? This is what I teach in so many of my like advanced practice or like advanced teaching is like this is about scaffolding the field through these markers or like references where you understand how this often goes. And when you have those maps, you can then meet somebody and understand where they are in those maps, which things are being expressed, where is expression being hampered. This is how you can safely speed up the course of treatment or intervention, basically, from a healthcare standpoint.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's like the thresholds that I mentioned that kind of have shame and fear and death all in them. Like your mapping of that was very helpful for me. Like when I'm in that space, I'm often doing this alone, and
Sure.
like when I'm in that space, it's like, oh, this is the thing Bree talks about, and like once I've done it enough times, also I kind of have
Yes.
intuitive knowing, but like when it's first getting there, it's like, am I still in the thing? Did I
Right.
take a fucking wrong turn last week and now I'm actually like, you know what I mean?
Exactly. Exactly. And listen, that's the thing that like a good spiritual model would do, right? Like this is what it like there are these maps that exist in Theravada Buddhism about awakening, and they have specific like markers that if you're a student and you come in to a teacher and tell them what's going on, that teacher knows where you are and what instructions to give. It's exactly the same for me when a person comes to me for a one-time consult or a 20,000th time session. I'm listening for all of that scaffolding, and then I know how to dance with that thing based on some of those key pieces. And it just makes everything effective and efficient in a way that otherwise you're shooting darts at like things that you think might be the thing. And this is mostly what we're doing in healing work. We're like,
Right.
well, I think it's probably this. And the acupuncturist is like, well, I think it's probably this. And I remember when we had the center, like I had all these amazing clinicians, and we would meet every week about clients that like people were struggling with to try and make sure we were on it with them. And I remember saying around year 7, look, we're doing a great job, but this has got to get more drilled down. This has got to get more efficient. We're still aiming imprecisely. And I wanted to understand how you could begin to replicate a precision of aim that had a wide degree of variability open to it. Because what we have now is no variability in our model, and we have mediocre aim. And
Yeah.
so I wanted very good aim with a lot of variance. And you have to eat the whole thing in order for that to happen. Nothing can be left out.
Yeah, I have a question about that. Sometimes I think about how maybe it's good for practitioners who are still on the earlier side of engaging with this because they're so close to where the people that they work with are, that there's something where they're like at a good space to teach people that thing. Like I've heard
Yes.
you say that you're not that into doing very deep trauma work with people because like you kind of like will refer someone out for that and then they'll come back to you later potentially to like do the next thing, you know? So I'm curious, how do you see it? Say you had right now an interdisciplinary team and everyone was super experienced and advanced, like what would you do with some of the earlier stages? Like how would you treat those?
I mean, for a lot of people, what they need is not a lot of talk therapy at earlier stages, but what they need is a lot of refeeding.
Yeah.
So that's what most of the trauma work actually is like return of coherence, refeeding the body. So for most people, I'd have them in at least 3 months of that before we would begin to work with the scaffolding or the architecture of their inner system. They first have to have their nervous system reactivity come down. They have to have decent gut health. We have to be looking at their hormone levels. Like, I want the biology to be working before I'm trying to take something else apart.
Yeah. Yeah, I relate to that. It was body work for me that really started to like
For most
make,
people,
yeah, make me feel settled enough that I could actually open up.
totally. And the irony is that so many of those things are not covered by insurance.
Right.
So for so many people, those become tertiary possibilities, and what they wind up with is constant psychotherapy that really they don't need at that stage. Um, yeah, this is why payer systems. I mean, that's a whole other talk, but yes, yeah,
Yeah.
it really the whole system is really not adequate to meet people in their complexity, their depth, or their actual movement process. So we artificially do all of those things, and then people don't get that well.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned effectiveness and efficiency kind of as values. I really noticed that when I work with you and a couple other people, like Rosa, our friend Rosa is another person who I noticed that with. It's like I can go get healing modalities where it's like, oh, this is pretty good. We like did some real stuff there. I could feel it, and then I go work with you and it's like, oh, that was like years of work in an hour. It's like, fuck that other stuff. I mean, I'm not gonna, why would I do that if I could do that? Like, so that really, there's something where like receiving a lot of this work is really informative for me as a practitioner, because it's like, okay, I want to be the one who's really, I have actually taken effectiveness and efficiency on as two of my four values in my practice. Like, yeah, let's not like waste a lot of time and money, let's do the thing.
Yeah, I always say to people, I don't want you to spend a long time with me. You know what I mean? Like, we'll do a piece, and if we need to keep working for a little while, we will. And then when there's a natural space of movement that we don't need to, you'll go away. You'll find your way back if you need to. I'm not worried. I'll have enough business forever. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't need to hold on to anything or anything. The lightning absolutely heard that. Holy cow.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've done like a couple of group containers with you, and then yeah, I've done like maybe 2 or 3 sessions with you over a year, just like when it really feels like, especially at one of those threshold moments or something, or I can't really like find some momentum in the system to push through wherever I am. I love that. I love that. Uh yeah, there's a lot of codependency out there in the world of healing itself. It's like you're seeking answers from something that's built on very faulty foundation.
100%.
Yeah.
Yep.
um cool. I think that's a great note to end on. What do you
Awesome.
think?
No, that seems great. I mean, we could keep talking forever, but that seems great. And I just want to say, too, I always so appreciate being in conversation with you. It always feels easy and enlivening. And I've said this before, but I always really appreciate your support for this work. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. It's been amazing to be in connection with you, and yeah, in just a number of ways, and anything I can do to support the proliferation of this work. Like, it's so when I watch that documentary, All of Me, there's something like, there's a lot of interviews with people, mostly females, and their families about eating disorders and stuff. And it's like, it's not until I really hear people who are in the throes of it talk about it that I really remember in a deeply visceral way. Like it's like its own thing that yeah, I don't remember it until I'm like really faced with it, and then I'm like, oh my God, I remember it so deeply. Like, I don't even know why I'm saying that now, except to say that I think this work is for everyone, not just for people with eating disorders. It's much wider spread than that, but that um aspect of life has such a deep place in my heart, and I want people to get the care that they need.
Same. I feel exactly the same way. It's why I haven't let that work go, even as the work has expanded so much, is that I'll always have like a super important part of my heart that wants that to get so much better.
Yeah. What is the best place for people to find? So you have this 3-part course coming up, and then also potentially working with you one-on-one, or just doing future containers and work with you. What's the best place to find you?
Probably the website, which is just breegreenberg.com. And through there, there's a way to contact me. And hopefully, I'm working on the website now, so it's going to be better soon. It'll have like an email sign up on there and more ongoing resources for people, including past talks that I've done that'll be there if people want to buy some of them, or some of them will just be downloadable. Um, it is going to get better. In the next couple weeks, it'll be way more robust.
Awesome, exciting. Yeah, I'll link your stuff. Thank you so much, Bree. I really appreciate the conversation. I think we talked about a lot of good stuff. I think there's a lot in there for people to chew on.
I hope so. It seemed like it. We spanned a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Bye, Bree.
Thank you, Jane.